Before we begin, take a moment. If you find this story interesting, leave a comment with the number 1 and subscribe to support me. But if it's not quite your style, comment with the number 2 so I can improve and do better next time. Your feedback is my greatest motivation. One quiet evening in the garage, boundaries blurred, and in a single moment, we crossed lines we thought were unbreakable, sealing us in a secret that would change everything. It was a still Saturday afternoon, one of those days where time seemed to slow. I'd been in the garage for hours, tinkering with my old car, a ritual that usually helped me unwind. Each twist of the wrench grounded me, but today my focus wavered. My mind drifted, barely anchored to the tasks at hand. Just as I was about to call it a day, I heard the familiar sound of heavy footsteps behind me, and a rush of cool air filled the room as the door creaked open. I turned around, wiping grease off my hands, and there he was, my uncle. There was something almost magnetic about him, the way he could command a space without saying a word. He leaned against the door frame, a faint smile playing on his lips, watching me with that knowing look he always had. "Thought I'd find you in here," he said, his voice low and calm, like he knew exactly what I'd been up to. He crossed his arms, his gaze never leaving me. I shrugged, trying to seem casual. "Just working on the car. Figured it could use a little maintenance." He nodded, stepping inside. "You're putting in a lot of time on this thing. Hoping to get it running perfectly?" "Yeah, something like that," I said, chuckling. "Or at least close enough that it doesn't break down halfway down the road." There was a short silence. I could feel his eyes on me, studying me. Like he was sizing me up or trying to read my thoughts. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. And there was a strange tone in his voice, almost like he was asking for permission for more than just helping with the car. "Sure," I replied, a little thrown off. Could always use another set of hands. He picked up a wrench from the workbench and started inspecting the engine, moving with that same steady confidence that made everything he did seem effortless. I watched him work, each movement practiced and precise, like he'd done this 1,000 times before. There was something captivating about it, almost mesmerizing. "You know, fixing things isn't just about muscle," he said after a few minutes, breaking the silence. "You gotta understand how each part works with the next. It's all about patience, attention to detail." I nodded, feeling a bit self-conscious. "Guess I've got a lot to learn." He smiled slightly, a look in his eyes that I couldn't quite decipher. "We all do. But that's the fun of it." For a while, we worked in silence, side by side, with only the sounds of metal clinking and tools scraping to fill the air. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the small garage windows, adding an odd warmth to the space. I could feel the weight of his presence next to me, close, but not too close, as if he was testing some invisible boundary. As we worked, I started to relax, feeling comfortable in his company. We'd always had a good relationship, even though he was something of a mystery to me. He'd been a constant in my life, showing up during holidays and random weekends, but never staying long enough for me to really understand him. He was older, more experienced, and seemed to know things about life that I could only guess at. I'd always admired him for that. He suddenly looked up, catching my eye. "You know," he began, his tone softer, almost reflective, "there's something about these quiet moments. They let you think. Really think about things." I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure what he meant. "I get what you mean," I replied, a little cautiously. He studied me, like he was waiting for me to say more. "Sometimes I think people forget to appreciate these moments. They're always rushing, always trying to get somewhere, but they never stop to think about what they're actually doing." I wasn't sure how to respond to that, but before I could think of anything to say, he chuckled softly, as though he found some private amusement in my silence. "Sorry," he said, giving me a small, apologetic smile. Didn't mean to get all philosophical on you. Guess it's just one of those days. No, it's fine, I said, trying to sound casual. I get it. Sometimes. He looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he put a hand on my shoulder, squeezing it lightly. You're a good kid, you know that. His words took me by surprise. It wasn't something he'd ever said to me before, and there was a warmth in his voice that caught me off guard. I mumbled a quick thanks, not sure what else to say. And busied myself with tightening a bolt, hoping he didn't notice the slight blush creeping up my face. The air between us shifted, growing heavier, filled with something unspoken. It was as if we were both aware of some invisible line we were towing, but neither of us was willing to acknowledge it. He was watching me again, his gaze steady, intense. And I felt a strange mixture of excitement and unease bubbling up inside me. After a few minutes, he broke the silence again. You know, when I was your age, I was always looking for something to keep me grounded. Felt like I was always chasing after the next big thing, never satisfied with what was right in front of me. I looked at him. Intrigued. He rarely talked about himself like this, and I found myself hanging on to his every word. So, did you ever find it? I asked, curious. He gave a small, rueful smile. Not really. Guess that's why I'm still searching. He paused, his eyes meeting mine. But sometimes you find something, or someone, that makes you stop, makes you think twice about where you're headed. The intensity in his gaze was almost overwhelming, and I felt my heart start to race. I wasn't sure if he meant me, if he was hinting at something, or if it was just my overactive imagination. But in that moment, it felt like he was speaking directly to me, like we shared some unspoken connection that was drawing us closer. For a while, neither of us said anything. The only sound was the faint ticking of the engine as it cooled and the occasional rustle of tools on the workbench. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were standing on the edge of something I couldn't quite understand but didn't want to back away from either. Finally, he let out a sigh and set down his wrench, breaking the tension. Well, I should probably get going, he said, though his voice held a note of reluctance. I nodded, feeling a pang of disappointment that I couldn't quite explain. Yeah, sure. Thanks for the help. He gave me one last look, a look that seemed to say more than words ever could. Anytime. He said softly. You know where to find me. With that, he turned and walked out, leaving me alone in the quiet, dimly lit garage. The door swung shut behind him. But the feeling he left behind lingered, heavy and unsettling, like a puzzle I couldn't quite solve. Meet him in the garage. I stared at my phone, feeling a strange rush of anticipation that I couldn't quite explain. When I stepped into the garage, he was already there, leaning against the workbench. His arms folded across his chest. The dim light cast long shadows across the room, making everything feel a bit surreal, like I'd stepped into a different world. Hey, I said. My voice sounding more uncertain than I'd intended. He looked up, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that made my pulse quicken. Hey, he replied. His gaze lingering on me in a way that made me feel both exposed and oddly exhilarated. You could say that, but you know how it is. Sometimes life gets in the way of things you actually want to focus on. There it was again, that underlying tension. Like we were dancing around something neither of us was willing to address directly. I shifted my weight, looking around the garage, trying to think of something to say, but my mind felt blank. He seemed to notice my discomfort and gave me a small, almost reassuring smile. Relax. I just thought we could hang out like we used to. I managed to nod, feeling a little foolish. Yeah. Of course. He motioned for me to sit down on an old, worn-out chair in the corner, and I complied, watching as he pulled up a stool and sat across from me. There was a strange intimacy in the setup. As though we'd created a small, private world separate from everything else. For a while, we just talked. We shared stories, laughed about things that had happened in the past, and slowly, I felt myself relaxing. But even as we chatted, there was an underlying tension that I couldn't ignore. It was like there was something more, something unspoken lurking just beneath the surface. Eventually, our conversation grew quieter, and we found ourselves sitting in comfortable silence. I was about to say something to break the stillness when he leaned forward. His eyes locking onto mine. "There's something I've been wanting to ask you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. My heart started pounding. "What's that?" I asked. He hesitated, glancing down at his hands before looking back up at me. "Do you ever feel like there's more to this? More to us?" I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. There was a vulnerability in his eyes, a raw honesty that I hadn't seen before, and it left me feeling both confused and intrigued. I don't know," I stammered, my mind racing. He gave a small nod, as if he understood my hesitation. "It's okay. I didn't mean to put you on the spot. I've been thinking a lot lately, and I guess I wanted to be honest with you." There was a long pause, and I could feel the weight of his words settling over me. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to deny it, to brush it off as nothing more than a passing thought. But another part of me, a part one hadn't been willing to acknowledge, felt drawn to the idea, to the possibility of something more. "It's strange," I finally said, my voice barely audible. "I never thought about it like that before, but maybe, yeah." He watched me, his gaze intense, as if he was trying to read my thoughts. "I don't want to push you into anything you're not comfortable with," he said softly, "but I also don't want to pretend that this, whatever this is, doesn't exist." I took a shaky breath, feeling the tension between us growing, filling the space like an invisible force. There was a part of me that wanted to step back, to walk away before things got too complicated. But another part, a stronger part, wanted to see where this would lead, to explore the uncharted territory that lay before us. "I think I understand," I murmured, my voice barely a whisper. He reached out, placing a hand on my shoulder. His touch was warm and reassuring. It was a simple gesture, but it sent a shiver down my spine, making me acutely aware of how close we were. Of the charged energy between us. For a moment, we sat there, frozen in that delicate balance between familiarity and something new, something unknown. I could feel my heart pounding, each beat echoing in my chest as I waited, unsure of what would happen next. Then slowly, he leaned back, his hand slipping from my shoulder, and I felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment. The tension was still there, but it was different now, quieter, more controlled. "Maybe we should take it one step at a time," he said, his voice soft, almost hesitant. "There's no need to rush into anything." I nodded, grateful for his restraint. "Yeah, I think that's probably best." He gave me a reassuring smile, and for the first time that evening, I felt a sense of peace, as though we'd reached an unspoken understanding. We didn't need to label whatever this was, didn't need to define it or confine it to any specific category. It was enough to know that there was something there, something worth exploring, even if we weren't quite ready to dive in head first. As we sat there, I realized that our relationship had shifted. That we were no longer just two people passing the time. There was a connection between us, something deeper and more complex than I'd ever anticipated. And though it scared me, it also filled me with a sense of excitement. The night wore on, and eventually, we said our goodbyes, each of us retreating back into our own worlds. But even as I lay in bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something monumental had happened, that we'd crossed an invisible line that couldn't be uncrossed. The following days were a whirlwind of emotions. Every time I saw him, every time our eyes met, there was an unspoken understanding, a silent acknowledgement of what we shared. It was exhilarating and terrifying all at once. And I found myself drawn to him in ways I couldn't explain. Yet despite the thrill, there was also an undeniable tension, a sense of uncertainty that hung over us like a cloud. We were both aware of the risks, the potential consequences of letting ourselves get too close. But at the same time, there was a part of me, a part one hadn't known existed, that wanted to take that risk, to see where this connection would lead. As the days turned into weeks, our interactions became more frequent, each encounter charged with that same underlying tension. We didn't need to say anything, the connection between us was palpable, a silent understanding that defied words. But with each passing day, I felt the weight of our unspoken bond growing, pressing down on me like an invisible force. I knew we couldn't continue like this forever, that eventually we'd have to confront the feelings that had been simmering just beneath the surface. And yet, despite the uncertainty, despite the tension, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of exhilaration. It was as if we were both standing on the edge of something monumental. Something that could change everything. For now, though, I was content to let things unfold naturally, to let the pieces fall into place on their own. Whatever the future held. I knew one thing for certain, our relationship would never be the same. We fell into a rhythm over the next few days, a quiet dance of stolen glances and shared silences that spoke volumes. Neither of us brought up that conversation in the garage, but it lingered between us, adding weight to every interaction that was both thrilling and nerve-wracking. We seemed to be teetering on the edge of something neither of us could define, but both of us felt. Then one evening, he messaged me. "Meet me in the garage." Just reading it sent a thrill through me, a nervous excitement that had me out the door almost immediately. I walked over, trying to keep my steps steady, though my heart was racing. When I entered the garage, he was already there, his back turned as he adjusted some tools on the workbench. He glanced over his shoulder as I walked in, a small smile playing on his lips. There was something different in his expression this time, something softer, more open. "Glad you could make it," he said, his voice calm and steady. But his eyes held a flicker of something that set my pulse racing. I smiled, trying to keep my composure. "Couldn't miss a chance to work on the car, right?" I said. He chuckled. But his gaze never left mine. "Right." We stood there in silence for a moment, the air thick with tension, as if the garage itself was holding its breath, waiting. He moved closer. His presence warm and solid beside me, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. "So, any progress?" I asked, gesturing toward the car. Though I knew that neither of us was really here to talk about that. "Not as much as I'd hoped," he said, his voice low, almost a murmur. He was so close now that I could feel the warmth radiating off him, his arm brushing against mine in the quiet intimacy of the garage. For a moment, we stood there side by side, our shoulders barely touching. The silence between us felt charged, like the air before a storm. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, pounding so loudly that I was sure he could hear it too. He turned to face me, his gaze intense, filled with that same unspoken question that had been hanging between us for so long. I felt my breath catch as he reached up, tucking a stray lock of hair behind my ear, his fingers lingering for just a moment longer than necessary. "You know," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I keep telling myself that this is just a phase, that I can let it go." But he trailed off, his eyes searching mine as if he was looking for an answer he didn't dare ask for out loud. I didn't know what to say. Every instinct told me to step back, to put some distance between us before things went too far, but my feet wouldn't move. And before I could even process what was happening, I found myself leaning in, caught in the pull of his gaze. And then, in one swift, almost hesitant movement, his lips brushed against mine, a soft, tentative kiss that sent a spark of warmth flooding through me. It was gentle, barely more than a whisper of contact, but it left me breathless. My heart pounding as though it was trying to leap out of my chest. He pulled back, his gaze searching mine as if waiting for a reaction, a signal that this was okay. I could see the uncertainty in his eyes, the vulnerability that he rarely showed, and it stirred something deep inside me, a feeling I hadn't even realized I'd been holding back. Without thinking, I reached up, my hand brushing against his cheek, and leaned in again. This time, the kiss was deeper, more certain. A wordless acknowledgement of the connection we both felt but had been too afraid to name. The world around us seemed to fade away, leaving only the warmth of his touch. The softness of his lips against mine. For a moment it was as if time itself had stopped, leaving us suspended in that fragile, precious instant. I could feel his hands on my shoulders, pulling me closer, and I leaned into him, losing myself in the intensity of the moment. When we finally broke apart, we stood there in silence, our breaths mingling in the stillness of the garage. I could feel my cheeks flush, my heart racing as I looked up at him, searching his face for some sign of what he was thinking. He gave a small, almost shy smile, his hand still resting lightly on my shoulder. "I didn't plan for this," he said, his voice soft, almost apologetic. "Me neither," I whispered, still catching my breath. "But I'm not sure I'd change it." He let out a soft laugh, a sound filled with relief and a hint of disbelief. "Neither would I." For a while, we just stood there, basking in the warmth of each other's presence, neither of us quite ready to let go. It was as if we'd finally crossed that invisible line that had been holding us back. And now that we were on the other side, there was no turning back. Eventually, he pulled me into a gentle embrace, his arms wrapping around me in a way that felt both protective and grounding. I leaned into him, closing my eyes and savoring the moment, feeling a sense of peace that I hadn't realized I'd been missing. The garage was quiet. The only sound was the soft hum of the night outside, and for once, I felt like everything was exactly as it should be. But deep down, I knew the truth. Our connection defied logic. We'd surrendered to an unstoppable force, our bodies intertwined, melting into each other's embrace. The thrill of the unknown coursed through my veins, yet I sensed the impending storm, questions, doubts, and the tangled web of complications. Still, in that fleeting moment, none of it mattered. His arms cradled me, a sanctuary of warmth. The rhythmic beat of his heart harmonized with mine. And I felt an overwhelming sense of belonging. Our love was a reckless abandon, a leap of faith into the unknown. After a while, he pulled back slightly, his hand reaching up to cup my face, his thumb brushing lightly against my cheek. "Are you okay with this?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, filled with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. I looked up at him, meeting his gaze with a quiet conviction that surprised even me. "Yeah," I said softly. "I am." He smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that made my heart skip a beat. "Good." The night wore on. And though we both knew we'd have to face reality eventually, for now, we were content to let it slip away, to lose ourselves in the quiet intimacy of the garage, hidden away from the rest of the world. As we stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, I felt a sense of clarity wash over me. This was real, whatever it was, and no matter what happened next, I knew that I wouldn't regret it. The connection we shared was undeniable, a bond that had grown quietly, almost unnoticed, until it had blossomed into something neither of us could ignore. In the back of my mind, I knew there would be challenges ahead, that we would have to navigate the complicated terrain of our feelings and the expectations of those around us. But for now, none of that mattered. All that mattered was this moment, this feeling of being truly seen, truly understood by someone who knew me better than anyone else. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the garage windows, casting a soft, golden glow over everything, I knew that our lives would never be the same. We had crossed a line, stepped into uncharted territory, and though the road ahead was uncertain, I was ready to face it, knowing that we would face it together. And as we held each other in the quiet stillness of the garage, I couldn't help but feel that somehow, Everything was exactly as it was meant to be. The days that followed felt like a dream. The one tinged with a kind of nervous energy kept me on edge in those stolen moments in the garage. We'd crossed into uncharted territory, a place we both wanted to explore but weren't sure how to navigate. And every time I saw him after that night, that same thrill and fear washed over me, both thrilling and grounding in a way I couldn't quite explain. We tried to keep things as they had been before. Routine, simple. But it was impossible. Every glance, every touch held a weight that hadn't been there before. It was as if we had built a world within a world, a fragile place we both retreated to in our minds, knowing full well it was only ours to inhabit, hidden from everyone else. One evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the garage in that warm, shadowed glow, I found myself there again, waiting, unsure of what the night would bring. The sounds of the house, quiet in the background, seemed far away as I sat on the old chair, fidgeting, trying to calm the flurry of emotions that had been bubbling under the surface all day. The door creaked open, and he stepped inside, his face etched with a quiet intensity. He didn't say anything at first, just watched me. A half-smile tugging at his lips as if he was reading my thoughts and finding them amusing. I broke the silence. "You always know how to keep me waiting." He chuckled softly, crossing the room in a few easy steps. "Maybe I just like to see if you'll keep waiting." We shared a brief laugh, the kind that seemed to dissolve the tension between us, if only for a moment. But as the laughter faded, we were left with the silence, with the weight of everything we hadn't said. He sat down across from me, his eyes meeting mine, searching, and suddenly, I felt more exposed than I ever had. "I don't know where this is going," he admitted, his voice low and honest, "but I do know that I don't want it to end." I felt a lump rise in my throat. My mind racing with 100 different thoughts, but none of them coherent. "Me neither," I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. "But how do we?" He took a deep breath, reaching across the small space between us to take my hand. His touch was warm, grounding, a steadying force that seemed to anchor me in place. "We'll take it one day at a time. No rush. No expectations. Just seeing where it leads." The simplicity of his words settled over me like a calming wave, and I found myself nodding, feeling a strange sense of peace that I hadn't expected. We didn't have to figure everything out at once. We could just be, in whatever way felt right. The next few weeks passed in a blur, a whirlwind of quiet moments shared, smiles, and those lingering touches that held so much more meaning than words ever could. We slipped into a routine, meeting in the garage whenever we could steal a moment away from prying eyes, away from the weight of expectations. It was our space, our sanctuary. But as time went on, the reality of what we were doing began to creep in, casting a shadow over the happiness we'd found. There was always the looming question of what would happen if anyone found out, if this delicate world we'd built was shattered by the harsh light of reality. I could see it in his eyes. Too, the quiet worry that settled over him whenever we were alone, though he tried his best to hide it. One night, as we sat together in the garage, that familiar tension weighed heavily between us. He was quiet, lost in thought, and I could feel the distance growing, a chasm that neither of us wanted to acknowledge. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice soft, almost pained. "I'm not sure we can keep this up forever." The words hit me like a punch to the gut, though a part of me had known it was coming. We were living on borrowed time, dancing around an unspoken truth that we both feared would catch up to us eventually. I looked down, my heart aching. "I know," I whispered, feeling the weight of those words settle over me like a shroud. He reached out, taking my hand in his. His grip was warm and reassuring, a lifeline. "It's not that I don't want this. You know that, right?" I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I know. It's just complicated." He gave a sad smile, his thumb brushing gently over the back of my hand. Yeah. It's complicated. We sat there in silence, the air thick with unspoken words, with a longing that neither of us knew how to express. The quiet felt oppressive, heavy, as if it was pressing down on us, forcing us to confront the reality we'd been trying to avoid. Finally, I looked up at him, searching his face for something, anything, that would ease the ache in my chest. "Do you regret it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated, his eyes meeting mine, and for a moment, I feared the answer. But then he shook his head, a small, genuine smile tugging at his lips. "No. I don't regret any of it." Relief washed over me, though it was tempered by the knowledge that this wasn't a solution, only a momentary comfort. We both knew that what we had couldn't last forever. That we were living on borrowed time. But in that moment, it was enough. We stayed there for a while, wrapped in each other's arms, savoring the quiet stolen moment, knowing full well that it might be one of our last. The world outside felt distant, irrelevant, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to forget the complications, to lose myself in the warmth of his embrace. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows, casting a soft glow over everything, he pulled back slightly, his gaze meeting mine. "No matter what happens," he said softly, "I want you to know that this meant something to me." I swallowed, my throat tight. It meant something to me too. We shared a sad smile. A silent acknowledgement of the reality we both knew was waiting for us outside those walls. There would be questions, decisions, choices that neither of us was ready to face. But for now, in that quiet tender moment, none of that mattered. As he left the garage that morning, his footsteps echoing softly in the stillness, I felt a strange sense of peace. It was bittersweet, tinged with a sadness that I couldn't quite shake. But there was also a sense of closure. A quiet understanding that we'd shared something unique, something that would stay with us no matter where life took us next. In the days that followed, we drifted apart, each of us slowly returning to the lives we'd left behind. We saw each other in passing, shared polite smiles, brief moments that felt both familiar and distant. But the closeness we'd shared, the secret world we'd built in the quiet intimacy of the garage, lingered like a ghost, a reminder of something beautiful and fleeting. Life moved on, as it always does. But that chapter, those quiet moments in the garage, remained etched in my memory. A cherished reminder of a time when everything felt possible. And though we went our separate ways, that connection, that bond we'd forged, was something I would carry with me, a quiet warmth in the depths of my heart. Time passed. Seasons changed. But every now and then, I'd catch a familiar scent, hear a certain laugh, and it would all come rushing back, a bittersweet reminder of a love that was never meant to last but was, in its own way, perfect. And in those moments, I would smile, remembering the quiet, hidden world we'd built, knowing that for a brief, beautiful time, we'd had something real.